Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 plagues, many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
I'd like to share with you some sources that have preoccupied me as this current plague began to strike. I'm a historian and I study 16th century Jewry. And during the first month of this pandemic, as the term unprecedented was heard again and again, I kept being pulled back to my 16th century sources. The idea that we were dealing with something unprecedented was terrifying, and finding so many discussions in my pre-modern sources that suddenly sounded familiar was strangely reassuring. These texts revealed to me that humanity often had to deal with such challenges, and that they did so with the same strange mix of anxiety, practicality, and hope as I observe among us today. Of course, the globalized 21st century world can turn epidemics into pandemics in ways unimaginable in the early modern period, the period that I studied. Yet their basic fears, the practical problems they were facing, and their core human sentiments are remarkably resonant with ours. I say strangely reassuring because the last thing you want to feel when reading about the disasters of a pre-modern civilization is a sense of recognition. As a denizen of the 21st century, I took comfort in considering myself immune in every sense of the word from such distinctly outdated threats. The world being brought to its knees by a virus feels vulnerable in a disturbingly pre-modern way. But recognizing our situation in the spectrum of ways that humans have devised to deal with such vulnerability in the past nonetheless heartens me in its own strange manner. I would like to share with you some of these sources, both for the intellectual joy of following the scholarly process that takes place in these rabbinic discussions of plagues and diseases, but also for the spiritual solace that they might provide, as they did for me. The first source. This is Rabbi Jacob Mull, also known as the Maharil, by his acronym Rabbi Yaakov Mull, who lived in the 15th century in the Rhineland. And what you're looking at is the cover of his book of Responsa. Responsa are answers to questions about halakha, about Jewish law, usually in letter form. And this was printed in the 16th century in Italy, but written, as I said, in the 15th century in the Rhineland. And let us take a look at this responsum, and let's take it apart a little bit. The question that was asked regarding what you wrote, that it is apparently forbidden to flee, and so on. So we don't have the original question that was asked to him. This is a paraphrase that the rabbi responding, that Maharil uses to summarize the question. And the question regarding what you wrote, so what the person asked to him, that it is apparently forbidden to flee, and so on. And he's talking about fleeing during a plague. And what he means by this apparently forbidden to flee, as we will discuss later, it's clear that people tended to flee the city when there was a plague. However, there's a statement in the Talmud that mentions that one is prohibited to flee the city, or that one shouldn't flee when there's a plague, and we'll return to the legal problem with this very soon. But this is not where Maharil begins. So he's apparently asked a question: what should we do? People tend to flee when there's a plague, but it seems from the Talmud that you're not supposed to flee when there is a plague. He does not start with the Talmud, he gets there later. He starts with something else, also a Talmudic source, but not the one about not fleeing. And he says, in the chapter Ze Borer, as you can see on this slide, we say, 7 years there was a pestilence, yet no one died before his time. This implies somewhat that one should not flee. So as I said, he doesn't start with that Talmudic statement that's explicitly about not fleeing. He starts by discussing fate. As it says in chapter Ze Borer, this is in Tractate Sanhedrin, and there it is stated that Shav Shani Hava Mutana Ve'inish Belo Shani Lo Shachiv. 7 years there was a pestilence, yet no one died before their time. So if everyone dies when it is decreed, right, no one dies before their time. There was a city where there was a pestilence for 7 years, yet only the people who were supposed to die actually died. Then if everyone dies exactly when God wants them to, what would be the point of taking any actions or precautions, right? What would even be the point of fleeing? It might be that that's what people do, but maybe it's pointless, right? If everyone dies exactly at their appointed time, maybe we should just sit back and trust God and trust that everything happens when it's supposed to. Now, this seemed a little strange to me, concerned as we were with taking precautions for the COVID-19, right? And for our plague, and thinking about what we could do to prevent it. And I liked seeing that for Maharil too, he wasn't about to take this so easily and say, no problem, just sit back and whoever's meant to die will die and don't do anything about it. And here you see the continuation of the response. So against this statement of the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin about nobody dying before their time, he says the following. However, it seems that this is simply a popular expression, the expression about nobody dies before their time. There was a pestilence for seven years and nobody died. For in the first chapter of Chagiga, here is his other Talmudic source that he presents to counter this idea of no one dying before their time. We say, there are those who are swept away without justice. Let us look at the source in Tractate Chagiga. When Rav Yosef reached this verse, he cried, but there are those swept away without justice. This is a verse from Proverbs, and it means that some people die without justice when they don't need to. He said, is there one who goes before his time? And the answer is yes, like this incident of Rabbi Rabbi, who would be frequented by the angel of death, who said to his agent, go and bring me Miriam, braider of women's hair. He went, but brought him Miriam, the raiser of babies. And in the Aramaic, they use the same word for this Miriam, the raiser of babies, and Miriam, the braider of women's hair. It's Miriam Megadla Se'ara, Se'ar Nashia, Miriam, the braider of women's hair, and Miriam Megadla Dardake, the one who raises babies. So you can understand that Miriam Megadla is what's confusing here and causes these mistaken identities. So here's a case where, as the source in Chagiga tells us, a very disconcerting tale. One of the sage, Rabbi Beva bar Abaya, who, so it seems, often hung out with the angel of death. And once the latter told his messenger, his agent, to bring him Miriam, the braider of hair. And in a tragic case of mistaken identity, this messenger brings him the wrong Miriam. He brings Miriam, who sounds similar, Miriam, the raiser of little children, Megadla Dardake instead. When questioned about this mishap, Rabbi Beva is told that this was permitted to happen since the unfortunate Miriam had just placed herself in a dangerous position. So this Miriam, the raiser of children, who was taken by accident, had put herself in a dangerous position, which meant that despite being the wrong person, they allowed her to die. Moreover, since the angel of death's quota was satisfied for that day, he decided that the Miriam who was meant to die could remain alive after all. In other words, placing yourself in a dangerous situation might mean that your end will come before it is meant to. Thus, not everything is preordained, and there might be a point in fleeing dangerous places, lest one be swept away innocently, as the verse in Proverbs said, there are those swept away without justice. In other words, you cannot just sit back and assume that things won't happen to you. Maharil then goes on and explains that plagues are exactly such a type of occurrence, the type of occurrence where people are sometimes swept away by the angel of death even if they didn't deserve it. And here we can see the continuation of Maharil's response. He says, we expound this from the verse, none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. Where is this verse from? No, none of you should go out of the opening of this house until the morning. The source he learns this from is Exodus. In the Talmud, we see that the rabbis learn from this verse of Exodus, and of course it is about the plague of the firstborn, that the Jewish people are told not to leave their homes until the morning. So while the plague is raging, they should stay inside. And this is where the rabbis learned from that it could be dangerous outside when there is a plague. How so? Rabbi Yaakov Mull explains this. He says, once power has been given to the destroyer, he does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. And this is why the Jews had to stay inside, because the angel of death, once he is meting out plagues, does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. He was given permission to slay. We go back to this source and we see, Rav Yosef taught, what is the meaning of that which is written? And none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. So that verse in Exodus about the plague of the firstborn. And he explains, once permission is granted to the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Therefore, as Maharil explains, it is dangerous to be in a situation of danger, and especially the plague. The plague is, in a way, the basic case where it is said that if you are outside, it doesn't matter if you deserve this or not. Of course, the Jews were chosen to leave Egypt, not to get the plague, but still, they should not be outside because it could strike even them. Now, Marie goes back to the original question that the questioner asked. How do we reconcile the fact that people were fleeing and the fact that Marie had now justified and said there's a very good point to fleeing when there's a plague, with the fact that the Talmud says, do not flee? And this is what he refers to when it says, regarding what we say in the chapter Hakones, gather your feet, which is derived from many verses. Chapter Hakones is a chapter in Tractate Bava Kama where it says, the rabbis learned, when there's a plague in the city, gather your feet. Gathering your feet means staying indoors, not leaving. So, how does he reconcile this problem? He explains, and about the issue that it says gather your feet, and yet we have the practice of fleeing and not gathering our feet, he makes a distinction. I heard from our teacher, Rabbi Shalom, this is Rabbi Shalom Neustadt, who was his teacher, may he live, that once the plague has begun and taken hold, and the angel of death has been given permission to go out openly, one should gather his feet. And it is also said, all roads are considered dangerous. So here are statements that say you should gather your feet, you should not be out in the road, it is dangerous. But he says in the beginning, it is good to flee. So he makes a distinction between the two different points in the plague. The beginning, at which you should flee, and the next point when the plague gets stronger, at which it is not good to flee anymore. And he says gather your feet refers to that point. So then he settled 2 points. The point of fate is settled. Epidemics are a prime example of the category of events where one could die regardless of one's prescribed fate or desert. Yes, everything is ordained by God, but there are times when the angel of destruction is permitted free rein. Once he roams the streets, no distinction is made between the righteous and those deserving of punishment, and anyone is fair game. This rings true for me with the arbitrariness of contagion and its terrifying exponential growth, taking along so many in its path with so little rhyme or reason. Therefore, he says, it makes a lot of sense to flee, to try to get away from the path of harm. The issue of faith, as I said, is settled. Yes, there's a purpose in fleeing, since the angel of death has given permission to roam free during plagues and attack anyone he wants. One should not sit back and assume one is safe, but rather take action to protect oneself. But then he still had to make sense of this contradiction between the fact that people would flee and that fleeing made sense, and the fact that the Talmud said, gather your feet, stay inside. And he did so exactly by saying that in the beginning of the plague, before it takes hold, that is your time to flee. Later on, once it takes hold, he writes the roads are considered dangerous and the angel of death is roaming, and then you should not flee anymore. And that's what the Talmud means when the Talmud says stay indoors. Now, what is this issue with leaving early? Clearly, we know that this was a practice. People did so. We know this from evidence from Jewish sources. We have many rabbis who write about how they fled because of the plague. So clearly, they were not disturbed by the Talmudic statement not to flee. Perhaps they did indeed flee early. There seems to be a point to this fleeing early. I brought you a treatise that includes all these different observations and explanations and advice about what they call the pestilence or the plague. And this was written in the 17th century, but it contains a lot of wisdom from before, and it was a well-known statement in the Middle Ages. This was both among common people and among learned people and those who knew a lot of medicine, and they stated this in the name of Hippocrates or of Galen sometimes. And here I'm citing from William Kemp, who wrote these, but you see this in different permutations and forms in many writings about the plague. And it seems that it was also a popular saying that people would say, and this is what he writes. And in this case, the counsel of Hippocrates in advising to change and flee the corrupted air is, and hath been received as an oracle, and as a proverb generally approved by all, the antidote made of 3 adverbs, cito, longe, tarde, or as he writes, flee or fly, flee quickly, go far away, and return slowly or after a long time, hath ofttimes proved effectual. So fleeing quickly, it seems, was not only an issue that Jews did. This leaving early at the beginning of the plague, it seems, was common wisdom as being the smart thing to do. But for Jews, this was especially important. And Maharil already hinted at that when he quotes the Jerusalem Talmud about all roads being dangerous. This is the front page of Yam Shel Shlomo, the Sea of Solomon, written by Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who's also known as Maharshal, again an acronym of the first letters of his name. And he wrote this in the 16th century in Lublin. And this is a commentary on the Talmud. So when he gets to the tractate in Bava Kama that we discussed, where the rabbis say, when there is a plague, gather your feet, in other words, stay indoors, he deals with that same question. If the Talmud says stay indoors, how come we flee? And most of his answer to this question comes from the sources that Maharil already presented, some of which we have seen about the angel of death, not distinguishing, and so on. And he also presents that answer that Maharil's own rabbi, Rabbi Shalom of Neustadt, gave him about distinguishing between the beginning of the plague and the end of the plague. And here you can see how he distinguishes these. We likewise say all roads are presumed dangerous. This is again the Jerusalem Talmud, which Maharil also mentioned. Therefore, it is not good to flee. And now he combines this idea of it not being good to flee with that point in time. It's not good to flee, he says, after the plague starts. But in the beginning, you can flee, especially after the plague has taken hold. The danger to those who flee among the Gentiles is greater than the danger of the plague, as is well known, due to our abundant sins. However, at the beginning, it is good to flee. So he starts explaining why fleeing at the onset of the plague might be fine, but during the later stage of the plague, it is more of a problem. And he relates this to this idea of the Jews being among the Gentiles. And he says, right, that during this time, the danger of the Gentiles is greater than the danger of the plague itself. So it seems perhaps that a reason why the roads are dangerous is because they were fearing violence. This particular danger increased when the plague evolved, especially if the plague was identified as having begun among Jews, whether this was truly the nexus of infection, as it indeed was at times, especially when Jews were living together in very cramped areas because they were not allowed to live outside of those areas, and the situation was sometimes not very sanitary. But sometimes, of course, they were just blamed for causing the plague, as we know so often takes place. At such a point, the danger of anti-Semitic violence is worse than the danger of the plague. And there is some evidence from historical sources that such violence was indeed a real risk, especially on the roads, and especially when epidemics that started in the Jewish areas already began to spread to other parts. So indeed, if you leave early, you might be fine, but once it is perceived as coming from the Jewish place and starts spreading, you might be in trouble. And here's one example of this evidence. See, for instance, this letter about Kazimierz, the Jewish area outside of Krakow, during the plague of 1588. The letter writer explains that the Jews were worried about violence because among Jews there was bad air. And this bad air is a reference to the miasma, which at the time was believed was causing the plagues. And this is what this letter writer writes to his family after he fled. He writes that there was bad air in Kazimierz, but in the town Krakow proper, there was no bad air. So it was identified as coming from the Jewish area. Therefore, no Jews could show themselves in the town or on the field because Haiduks, brigands, these armed people, were knocking everything down. Thus, then as now, plagues stoke the fires of hatred and xenophobia. But historical sources need not only be disconcerting. This is Rabbitheim Ben Betzello of Friedberg. He's the brother of the Maharal of Prague of the Golem fame, and he lived in the city called Friedberg. And at some point tells us a story of a plague, which he relates in the introduction to this book called Sefer HaChaim, the Book of Life. In Sefer HaChaim, he writes mainly commentaries on Agadita, on not the halachic part of the Talmud, but the tales, the stories in the Talmud. And he writes in this introduction that he wasn't planning on writing this work. He didn't think that a book on Agadita was quite at his scholarly level. It was maybe considered too easy or too soft. But his students asked and he decided to do it. And this is the background story that he gives us in the introduction of why he decided to do it. This is how the introduction begins. I will remember the charity of God and his greatness, for all the good he has granted me in his mercy. For in 1578, he saved my soul from death. Death climbed up to the windows of my home back then, and our servant died from the plague. May we be spared. my daughter, as well as another boy who fell ill with that disease, and they were rescued by God's mercy. And I and my children remained within this big upheaval. So they didn't die. One of the servants died, but their troubles weren't over yet. The doors of my home were closed behind me. And note the passive way he says this. We're not sure if this is self-imposed quarantine or if this was forced upon him, but either way, he's stuck alone at home for almost 2 months without anyone exiting or entering. Rabbi Chaim Friedberg was left in his house quarantined with his family members, either by his own volition or because the community made him do it. But the situation was getting very difficult for him. He writes, at that time, the upheavals of the time and its worries surrounded me. And what he does when he is sequestered at home is he tries to study. At that time, the upheavals of time and its worries surrounded me, and when I tried to save my soul and flee to the town of books, he calls it Kiryat Sefer, which is both a town, but also here he means, right, his books, his study, which is like a screen against hardships and a shelter from the angel of death. The thick fog of worry prevented me from breathing the fresh air and rejoicing in the joys of Abaye and Rava. To study the law, or halakha, requires clarity, like a day when the north wind blows and the sky is clear. Desperately, he tried to burrow himself into the halakha, the legal sections of the Talmud called the disputes of Abaye and Rava, in order to escape his sorrows. He was appalled, however, to find himself too preoccupied with worry to properly concentrate on the legal discussions. His mind is filled with fog and with anxiety. Terrifyingly, he could not focus enough to study halakha. As he writes, the study of halakha requires clarity, like a day when the north wind blows and the sky is clear. He couldn't achieve this clarity. This too sounded all too familiar to me, as we all discovered soon enough that having lots of time at home with everything being cancelled outside does not translate into heightened productivity. Anxiety and preoccupation has its way of making it impossible to focus, let alone those of us who were locked down with little children and no childcare or help. Rabbi Chaim too found it difficult to muster the kind of concentration required for studying halakha. The alternative, however, was too horrible to contemplate. Eddie writes in the last line on this slide here, but to sit idle from Torah, God forbid, for it is our life and the length of our days. Suddenly, Rabbi Chaim is rescued. He hears a voice. As my heart was sitting in the middle of an ocean of turmoil due to terror and fear of death, a voice called to me. Stand up and strengthen yourself, for you have found relief for your misery. What came to rescue him? The texts coming to the rescue are the Agadata, the portions of the Talmud relating not the law, but stories, tales, and occurrences. In the past, Rabbi Chaim had rejected his students' pleas to write down his teachings about those tales because they were considered less serious than the more demanding halachic sections. In these desperate times, however, Agadata was precisely suitable. He writes that just as clarity and shining sun is perfect for studying halakha because that clarity is required for the difficult halachic portions, he writes, so too, the appropriate time for studying Agadata is a time of darkness, when the human spirit is clouded from the worries of the time, and his sorrow is like a thick mist, the muddy clouds of human thoughts. In those cases, he concludes, there is nothing better than letting one's heart be pulled to the words of Agadah, instead of De'agah, as he writes, for their letters are the same. By scrambling and unscrambling this anagram, he takes the letters of worry and rearranges them to spell Agadah, substituting stories for worries. Hearing the call of the Agadata, Rabbi Chaim's spirit is restored to him, and he decides to write down his insights on the topic. As he concludes, among these words, all those burdened with turmoil can enjoy and wander, and they too will find relief for their worries. Amidst all this dire news, I too am trying to perform this trick of swapping out the letters of worry to spell story or history instead. I hope all this will soon be behind us. In the meantime, I'm sharing these sources with you so that you may wander among them and perhaps find some relief or distraction from plagues and worries.